everyone. Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to this History Book Club reading of The Kennedys After Camelot by New York Times bestselling author J. Randy Taraborelli. Please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and if you want to catch up on any previous episodes that you might have missed in this series, I will drop a link to the full playlist in the description where you can listen to every episode back to back. And if you'd like to support all my hard work bringing you these book clubs, check out my wish list at giftapp.com/reallaurispencer, where you can select a book that you'd like me to consider for a future book club reading. There are so many cool Kennedy family history books that are on my wish list. I'm sure you can find one that you'd like me to read. You can also follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, Rumble, and Substack. You can become a monthly supporter on Patreon or just make a quick one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee if you enjoy these book clubs and just want to say thanks. So today in episode 5, we're going to talk about Ethel Kennedy, the widow of Senator Robert Kennedy, mother of 11 children, including our current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We will explore the many challenges she faced trying to raise all these kids who grew up in the long shadow of a father that some of the younger ones barely remembered, and one, their daughter Rory, never even met. She was born after his assassination in 1968, and that was when the wheels just started coming off, as you'll hear in this chapter, which is packed with Kennedy chaos. And of course, Ethel Kennedy just passed away at the age of 93 in October of 2024. Today's episode, it's going to be a shorter one. I'm just reading some selected excerpts from this chapter in Taraborelli's book about Ethel, not the full chapter, because much of these same stories are covered in much greater detail, and much better in my opinion, by Ethel Kennedy's biographer, Jerry Oppenheimer, in his 2 books, The Other Mrs. Kennedy, which is all about Ethel, and also the book he wrote about her son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., The Dark Side of RFK Jr. I recently did a book club reading of Oppenheimer's book about HHS Secretary Kennedy, which you should definitely check out if you want to learn more about his troubled relationship with his mother Ethel, all the way from early childhood. You can listen to The Dark Side of RFK Jr. right here on my channel, and I recommend listening to episodes 1 through 6, which provide a lot more context to this story and serve as a perfect complement to today's episode. I'll put a link to that playlist, The Dark Side of RFK Jr., down in the comments section. So if you're ready, let's get started. Open your books. If you're reading along with me in the hardcover edition of After Camelot, we're going to be starting today's reading on page 112, 112, Part 5, Ethel. When the lives of Ethel Skakel and Robert Kennedy are considered, it is clear they had much more in common even than marriage to each other and being the pugnacious runts of high-profile, large, and prosperous Roman Catholic families fraught with both triumph and tragedy. Ethel and Bobby began going steady within a few months of their first meeting and became engaged 2 years later. For many observers, the relationship seemed to lack the kind of passion usually associated with young love. They were more like brother and sister than 2 youngsters on the threshold of a lifetime commitment. Indeed, Ethel remained a virgin until her wedding night. She once famously stated that she was so inexperienced, Bobby was finished before I even got into the room. But in a veiled reference to their many children, we later got the hang of it. Their marriage took place on June 17, 1950, at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was a lavish affair planned and executed with great taste by her mother, Big Ann Skakel, and witnessed by more than 2,000 people, many uninvited, who jammed the flower-filled sanctuary. The couple was attended by siblings from their respective large families, with JFK as his brother's best man and Pat Skakel as her sister's maid of honor. The happy couple settled into their first home in Charlottesville, Virginia, until Bobby finished law school at UVA. 2 weeks shy of their first wedding anniversary, Bobby and Ethel welcomed a baby girl, Kathleen, on Independence Day, 1951. With a law degree now in hand, Bobby, living in Washington, D.C., went to work briefly for the Department of Justice before resigning to manage JFK's successful Senate campaign in Massachusetts. One of Jack's key committee assignments was as a member of the Government Operations Committee, chaired by the demagogue Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, an avowed and outspoken anti-communist who attained instant notoriety in his conduct of the so-called Army McCarthy hearings, televised in real time to the nation. Bobby was hired as minority counsel to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, with Roy Cohn doing duty as majority counsel. While expecting their fifth child, Bobby and Ethel purchased the sprawling antebellum estate Hickory Hill in Virginia from Jack and Jackie in 1957. 9 months before they moved into the property, tragedy struck when Ethel's parents, Anne and George, died in a fiery plane crash near Oklahoma City. 3 days later, she joined her siblings and their families at St. Mary's in Greenwich for her parents' funeral, a solemn requiem high mass. As was so often the case with the way her mother-in-law Rose confronted her own many tragedies, Ethel was shored up by her unwavering faith and the firm belief that God's will be done. Yet there was something about the way she dealt with the death of her parents that some people found disconcerting. She didn't let it in, said a relative of hers, who obviously chose to be anonymous to this author, saying, quote, "The next day it was as if it hadn't happened. She kept saying they were both in a better place, and that was the end of it. It felt as if she never really grieved, that she kept her emotions bottled, and instead just threw herself into her life with Bobby and the children." Bobby soon became quite crucial to Jack and Joe, the ambassador's presidential ambitions, and over the next 4 years devoted himself to that successful end. When JFK and Jackie found themselves in the White House, Bobby and Ethel's stock zoomed. Now, as Attorney General and head of the Department of Justice, Bobby was able to claim his own place in the spotlight, Ethel dutifully at his side. She eagerly courted the press and happily fed them whenever they staked out Hickory Hill on some breaking story. The press loved her in return and rewarded her with much positive media attention when she wanted it, and respected her privacy when she requested it. They were a great team, Bobby and Ethel, whom he called Ethy for short. No matter how popular she was, though, everyone knew that it was her sister-in-law, Jackie, who was the most acclaimed of the Kennedy wives, certainly the one thought to have the most style. Maybe this was unfair, because Ethel certainly had her own fashion sense and was quite the clothes horse, too. In fact, she spent money like mad. For instance, her clothing expenses were often tripled because she liked to have not one, but usually 2 backups for each of her designer dresses, Oscar de la Renta being her favorite designer. She also wanted de la Renta's designs in different colors. She loved imported cosmetics as well. She spent so much money on fancy imported cosmetics, Rose actually went over to the house one day with a clipboard to take an inventory, said Barbara Gibson, Rose's secretary, describing a day in 1970. Quote, "She sat in the bathroom, writing down the names of cosmetics, and when she finished, she and Ethel had a loud fight about it, but Ethel didn't cut back. 'That money is mine and Bobby's as much as it is anyone else's,' Ethel said, and she was right to an extent. The money came from trusts that Joseph had set up for each family, and Ethel's, Jackie's, all of the families, in fact, got about $150,000 a year to live on, which was a lot of money in the late 1960s. The average per capita income in 1970 was $9,350. Rose was just afraid Ethel was going to go through it all, so she always had Stephen Smith knocking on Ethel's door to cut back. It never worked. Still, even with her own style, Ethel apparently felt she had to defer to Jackie when it came to fashion sense. Andy Williams, the popular entertainer, had for many years been one of Ethel's closest friends. He had also been one of Bobby Kennedy's best friends back in the 1960s. In fact, at Ethel's request, he sang at Bobby's funeral. And as a final gesture to their friendship, Bobby was buried wearing one of Andy's favorite ties. After he separated from his wife, the singer Claudine Langer, in the late 1960s, Andy started dating Ethel. We had a lot of fun, he recalled, of his many years at Ethel's side. She was so fascinating to me and surprising. For instance, she knew the words to pretty much every Broadway show tune, so we would sing a lot, and she had a very good voice. She also knew all of my songs, Moon River, Almost There, all of them. We'd play golf, we'd sail. Sometimes there were so many people on the boat, along with picnic baskets and wine and sodas and all sorts of games, the boat would practically be sinking before we would even be out in deep water. She would say, "It's okay, Andy, we'll just swim back to shore." I adored her, but it wasn't like the fan magazines made it out to be, Andy continued. They had us living together, married, her pregnant with my child. The truth was very different. I could never replace Bobby in her life, and I wouldn't have tried. That said, I think if she had been interested, maybe something could have come of us with the passing of time, but there was no way she could be interested in another man after Bobby. She told me once, "My love for Bobby is eternal. Do you know how long eternity is?" she asked. I said I did. And she said, "Well, it's 100 times longer than what you think it is." It was a sunny day in August 1969 when Rose Kennedy's secretary, Barbara Gibson, found Ethel Kennedy sitting in the kitchen of her home at the Kennedy compound, crying. "Why, what's wrong, Mrs. Kennedy?" she asked. Ethel looked up and with reddened eyes and said that Bobby had been gone for a year, and as a result, chaos had broken out in her home. She said that she could not figure out how to handle her children. She had just learned that morning that Bobby Jr. was being intimate with a local girl, and of course, as a Catholic and a mother, it was against everything she believed. Ethel was clearly distressed. "He's 15, and this is what he's doing?" Ethel asked. She then said that she didn't know how to punish her son because, as she put it, nothing works. "If you want my opinion, I think you should ban him from the household altogether," Barbara Gibson suggested, according to her memory of the conversation. "Just throw him out, Mrs. Kennedy. That's what my mother would do, and that's what I would do if he were my son. That's the only thing that will teach him." Ethel looked surprised. "Can I do that?" she wondered. "Is it legal for a mother to do that?" Barbara Gibson smiled. "You're Ethel Kennedy," she said. "You're not going to get arrested for disciplining your child." The decision was made then. Ethel said she was going to do as Barbara suggested. Now that she had a solution in place, unconventional though it might have been, Ethel seemed to feel better. That night, she gave Bobby Jr. the bad news. He was banished from the home he and his family shared at the compound. "But where am I supposed to live?" he asked. "That's your problem," Ethel told him. "If you can't live by my rules, then you can't live in this house." That night, young Bobby Kennedy pitched a tent on the beach where he would sleep for the next 2 weeks. At night, he would sneak into the homes of relatives in the compound and raid their refrigerators for food. Sergeant Shriver knew what he was up to and always made sure there was some chicken in the refrigerator for his outlawed nephew, recalled Barbara Gibson. I don't know that the punishment did much good, though. I think Bobby just looked at it as an adventure. I felt badly for Ethel. The kids made her life very difficult when they were young. She was very complex. It took me years to understand her. Ethel hadn't been herself since Bobby was murdered. Those who knew her well found it ironic that she had just been on the cover of Time magazine a few months before the Chappaquiddick incident in a story about her courage and bravery, in which she was portrayed as, quote, the most remarkable member of her remarkable family. New York Senator Jacob Javits described her in the article as, quote, the greatest of all the Kennedys, male or female. Well, that was a lot to live up to, especially since privately Ethel didn't feel very courageous or brave. Rather, she was often consumed with confusion and anger about the way things had turned out for her and her family. She and Bobby had so many plans, so much to do. He had been such a good and decent man who only cared about being of service to others. A deeply religious woman, Ethel couldn't understand why God had taken him from her and their children. Like her mother-in-law and just about all of the members of the family, Ethel was a devout Catholic. Her daughter, Carrie Kennedy Cuomo, who was once married to Andrew Cuomo, currently running for mayor of New York City, former New York Governor Cuomo, said in 2010 of her mother, quote, she still goes to Mass every day of her life. She prays on her knees before church, prays before every meal, and prays on her knees before going to bed. Still, even Ethel's faith could not give her the strength on what she called the bad days. After all, as either the Kennedy patriarch, Joseph, or Bobby once put it, depending on which family member you talk to, Kennedys don't cry. Privately, though, Ethel felt she had a right to her anger. That she had so many children to care for, it made things that much more difficult for her. When Bobby was alive, Ethel's home was always filled with politicians and reporters and the most interesting mix of people. He had a knack for mixing with everyone and enjoyed holding court as the most unlikely of viewpoints converged. He loved to debate. He enjoyed differences of opinion. Nothing pleased him more than inviting a diverse mix of people over to Hickory Hill for a rousing game of touch football on the expansive lawn, and then a serious debate about politics at the dinner table. It was fun and exciting, and as Ethel put it, it was like being the center of the universe. But now that Bobby was gone, the house was just filled with unhappy children. It was difficult for Ethel to reconcile such a dramatic lifestyle change. She always knew what she had to do to survive, though. The way she always coped with sadness was to ignore it as best she could. It was as if she feared that to acknowledge it would have been to risk falling into a deep emotional abyss from which she could never be rescued. Therefore, she never talked about the past. She didn't talk about Jack or Bobby or any of her loved ones who had died. Her parents in a plane crash in 1955, her brother in another plane crash 10 years later, other than to place the deceased in the context of their heavenly mission, which was to watch over the rest of the family left behind and take care of them from on high. This kind of avoidance frustrated many of her family members, especially her sons, who just wanted to have a reasonable conversation with their mother about their deceased father. For some of them, such as David and Michael, that they could never address their father's murder in any constructive way seemed to create an environment in which the only way they felt able to survive was to escape, either with alcohol or narcotics. There was also a pervasive feeling that some secret was being kept, that there was information not being revealed to them about the murders of Jack and Bobby, and as Patrick Kennedy, Ted's son, once observed, quote, "It's your secrets that make you drink, keeping them, wondering about them, fearing them." Within just a very short time after Bobby's death in 1968, Ethel Kennedy's oldest sons, Joe, Bobby, and David, became very hard to control, especially during their annual summers in Hyannisport. It was easy to understand that the older children were traumatized by the death of their father, and the youngest would always feel a sense of longing for the dad they barely remembered. There was a lot of sadness, recalled one of Ethel's employees at that time, but it was mixed with natural teenage rebellion and also a sense of entitlement. From an early age, the kids were raised to believe that they were special. They got a lot of press coverage and attention, and it went to their heads. And of course, there were so many of them. Ethel was at a loss. She called it my cross to bear. She relied on the senator, Ted Kennedy, a lot, and he did his best, but it was hard because he too was grieving. Bobby and Ethel's oldest son, and also the oldest of the third generation of Kennedys, was Joseph Kennedy II, just known as Joe. From the beginning, there seemed to be a lot of pressure on him. For instance, just 2 days after JFK's assassination on November 24th, 1963, his father wrote him a letter that suggests extremely high expectations of an 11-year-old. Quote, "You are the oldest of the male grandchildren," Bobby wrote. "You have a special and particular responsibility now, which I know you will fulfill. Remember all the things that Jack started. Be kind to others that are less fortunate than we, and love our country." Of course, Bobby Kennedy's death hit Joe, now 16, very hard. He not only loved his father, but also admired him greatly, and therefore the despair he felt at losing him so suddenly was almost overwhelming. It had actually been his gut-wrenching duty to inform his siblings of their father's death. As it happened, Joe had been at boarding school when his dad was shot and was flown across the country to be at his deathbed with some of his siblings who were already out on the West Coast. When Bobby finally died, Ethel shut down completely and was unable to tell her children about it. So it was left to Joe, who was just 15 at the time, to try to make sense of it all with his siblings. Because Bobby had been such a hero to him, Joe felt on a very deep level that there was no way he would ever be able to measure up to his father's standard of greatness, no matter how hard he tried. The fact that he sat in his father's chair at the dinner table after Bobby was gone likely didn't help matters either. Barbara Gibson, who knew Joe very well when he was a boy, recalled, quote, "I think he felt as if he wasn't smart enough, wasn't good-looking enough, wasn't Kennedy enough," is how he would put it to me, to take his father's place in the family. He was a muscular guy who started to use brawn to get his way. In other words, he became a bit of a bully. It was a defensive mechanism, we all knew it. It also didn't help that there was a sense of Joe as not being very smart. "It's a shame," Rose Kennedy told Gibson during one of their daily walks on the beach, "that Joe isn't very smart, especially with him being the oldest boy. In fact, while Joe was having a very difficult time in school, it was because he was dyslexic. He wasn't dumb, or at least that's how he sees it today. He was never tested for dyslexia, and back in 1968, no one really understood that disability. However, he was sure he had it then, and believes he still does today, and that he would have benefited greatly by some sort of treatment for it. Meanwhile, when Joe asked his mother if he could go to Spain in the summer of 1968 with a friend named Chuck McDermott, she decided to let him go. She talked it over with Ted, but they decided it would do Joe some good, said one of Ethel's relatives. But, to be honest, I always felt that it did Ethel more good to not have to worry about the kids that summer. I think that's how Ted saw it, too. Also that same summer, Ethel sent Bobby Jr. off to Africa in the company of JFK's prep school roommate, Lem Billings, who had become a close family friend and who would be very influential in the lives of all the boys. Billings thought the world of Bobby and wanted to do what he could to help his friend's sons through what he knew would be a difficult adolescence. The stories he told and the examples he set gave us all a link to our dead fathers and to the generations before us, Bobby Jr. later said. In many ways, he said, Lem was a father to me, and he was the best friend I will ever have. When Bobby Jr. returned from his African trip, he ended up being suspended from Millbrook School, the Dutchess County prep school he'd attended for 2 years. Then came the episode of having sex in the compound with a local girl and his subsequent forced exile from Ethel's home. The problem was that while he was banished and sleeping in a tent, he and his brothers formed a little gang. And today, all of these years later, some people who live in Hyannisport still talk about the Hyannisport Terrors. The HPTs, the Hyannisport Terrors, was the name that Joe, 17, Bobby Jr., 15, and David, 14, came up with for the little gang they'd formed, along with several other youngsters in the Cape Cod neighborhood. The 3 boys would sneak out of Ethel's home in the middle of the night, race down to the Shriver's home nearby, and meet with Eunice and Sargent's boy, Bobby, and Pat's son, Christopher, who was often visiting. They'd then don dark clothing and smear black grease on their faces to hide their identities, and take off for a night of misbehavior, often high on marijuana and on occasion even LSD. Usually they'd meet 3 or 4 other kids in Hyannis and spend the nights causing all sorts of trouble, recalled Thomas Langford, who knew the Kennedy boys well at that time. He was 17 then, and as he put it, a charter member of the HPTs. Sometimes I played along when I had the nerve. We'd shoot off firecrackers, deflate people's tires, stick potatoes in the exhaust pipes of police cars, turn over trash cans, mess around with girls, all sorts of mischief. After we did our bit, Ethel would get calls from everyone in town complaining about it. At first she used to say, "Well, my kids were home asleep last night. I don't know what you're talking about." But one night she waited up, and sure enough, she caught me, Bobby, and David jumping out one of the second-floor windows of her home. She chased us all over the compound in the middle of the night in her nightgown and bare feet, finally losing us somewhere on the stretch of beach. The next morning, the brothers told me they snuck back in the house while she was still asleep. But then she got up before they did and locked them both in their bedroom. When she finally let them out at about 8 that night, they took off with one of her sheets. Apparently, during their time alone all day, they'd made a makeshift flag out of it, which had emblazoned on it the words, HPT's rule. That night, they rigged it so that they could get it up on the steeple of a local church, St. Andrew's Presbyterian. I happened to be at Ethel's sitting in the living room the next day watching TV with Bobby Shriver when the doorbell rang. According to Thomas Langford, Ethel went to the door to find a man standing there with a bedsheet in his hand. He turned out to be the minister of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. "Mrs. Kennedy, I think this belongs to you," he said. Ethel looked perplexed. "But what is it, Reverend?" He said, "It's a sheet that I think your boys hung from the steeple of St. Andrew's Presbyterian." Ethel protested. "My boys are Catholic," she said. "They would never do such a thing." The Reverend then turned over a corner of the sheet and showed it to her. On it were the initials RFK, obviously for Robert Francis Kennedy. For a moment, Ethel had no words. "The next time your boys want to fly a flag, ask them to do so from the steeple of the Catholic Church, not from mine." With that, he handed Ethel the sheet and took his leave. Ethel closed the door. Then, at the top of her lungs, she looked up to the heavens and screamed out, "Lord, give me strength." It was all just mischief, but troubling just the same when the stories would get back to Ethel or the other adults in the family. For instance, one prank had the boys playing in busy Hyannisport tourist traffic, only to have one kid fall to the ground while another smacked the back of a car, making a loud noise. Then they would all gather around their fallen friend and shout hysterical sentiments at the driver, such as, "You've just killed another Kennedy." When panicked people came to the aid of the young Kennedy sprawled in the middle of the road, the boys would milk it for all it was worth by trying to get the boy to move his legs and then saying it looked as if he'd been paralyzed. But then the fallen Kennedy would suddenly stand up and walk away. At that, the other boys would start laughing and proclaim, "Look, it's a Kennedy miracle," and then race off, leaving a crowd of very upset Hyannisport tourists in their wake. The stories are legendary in Cape Cod, even today. One could write an entire book on the mayhem the HPTs caused in Hyannis in the late 60s and into the 1970s. One could also fill a tome with the many times that Ted Kennedy sat down with his nephews to try and reason with them. We're probably talking on a weekly basis, is how Thomas Langford put it. Ethel would call in tears, and Ted would come running, saying, "Don't worry, Effie, I'll take care of it." That was just their dynamic. He'd put the boys in a room and give them a good talking to, telling them that their father would not approve, that sort of thing. It didn't much matter, though. After each time, he and Ethel would reconvene, and she would say, "Well, what do you think?" And he would say, "I did my best. Let's see if it sticks." Generally, accounts of her life over the years have had it that Ethel Kennedy raised a truly unruly bunch. It's not entirely true. The fact is, she had 11 children, and of them, only 3 presented real problems, and that was the eldest boys, Joe, Bobby, and David. The rest of the kids were generally well behaved, even though some of her older sons would find themselves in trouble from time to time. By the summer of 1970, Kathleen Hartington was 18, Joseph Patrick II, 17, Robert Francis Jr., 16, David Anthony, 15, Mary Courtney, 13, Michael Lemoyne, 11, Mary Kennedy, 10, Christopher George, 6, Matthew Maxwell, 5, Douglas Harriman, 3, and Rory Elizabeth, 2. Of course, each of Ethel's older boys had his own distinct personality and character, but one challenge they all faced was that they had no choice because of their lineage but to do something truly significant with their lives. We felt a real pressure to be worthy of the name Kennedy, is how Joe once put it. There was always so much emphasis on being of service. Make your life count was something we all heard a lot. Even if someone wasn't preaching it to us in the moment, all you had to do was think about the family's history and how important Jack and Bobby and even Ted had been to America to feel sort of overwhelmed by it. So as a kid, yes, I think the best way to put it is that we were overwhelmed by it all, and it could be said we acted out because of it. We were often reminded that this country has been very good to the Kennedys and that we owed it some kind of reciprocal debt in return, Bobby Kennedy Jr. later said. That the money was not all ours, and the privilege and the power was not just ours to do what we wanted with, that we had to use it in some way to serve others. Otherwise, we would be wasting what we'd been given. I remember one time when my father returned from Appalachia, where he'd found 3 families living in a one-room shack, and the kids were going to bed hungry. And he came back home just in time for dinner, and over the meal he said to us, "You know, you're lucky to be eating all this food in this wonderful house where you have all your own rooms to sleep in, and I hope and pray that when you guys grow up, you'll be able to do something to help people." We clearly heard St. Luke's admonition that from those who have been given, much, much shall be expected. Was it pressure? Did we see it as pressure? Yes. Perhaps sensing that there was no way they would ever be able to fill all of the shoes of their ancestors, many of the next generation of boys spent their adolescence trying to fit into a caricature-like mold of what they figured it was supposed to be like to be a Kennedy. Or as Chris Lawford explained, quote, "From an early age, our purpose was to become more Kennedy, more brave, more reckless, more teeth, more charisma, better sailors, better football players, better with the ladies." This is what we were looking for, what we would have liked to recreate, but we never had a snowball's chance in hell of doing it. The premature deaths of Jack and Bobby Kennedy elevated them to mythic proportions, their greatness undiminished, their human failings forgotten. They were our benchmarks, which on a deep, unspoken level we knew we would never reach. As adults, I think we made up for it, but as kids, we were a handful, Bobby Kennedy Jr. later admitted. Our mother did the best she could, but in her defense, there was pretty much no way to handle us. We were pretty bad. On the night of July 10th, 1970, Ethel and Eunice Kennedy were having dinner at Eunice's home in the Kennedy compound when a maid came into the dining room and informed them that there was a team of police officers on the property looking for them. "Now, what in the Sam Hill is this about?" Eunice said, using a popular slang phrase of the times. 10 minutes later, the officers showed up at Eunice's front door and, much to her and Ethel's astonishment, announced that Bobby, Sergeant Shriver III, and Ethel's Bobby Jr., the two Bobbies, both just 16 years old, were being charged with marijuana possession. In the 1960s and 70s, rampant drug use among American youth had increased by troubling leaps and bounds. The list of fallen adolescents included a growing number of sons and daughters of prominent families, and the Kennedys were not immune to the trend. Sergeant Shriver had always recognized that recreational drugs were widely used in the Cape Cod area, and at one point he and Eunice had considered sending their sons elsewhere for the summer for that very reason. However, Eunice had said that she felt doing so would be copping out, just to keep her children away from temptation. "Nowhere is safe, really," she'd said. "The country is riddled with drugs from one end to the other. I think protection has to come from within the family itself." Eunice just hoped she had given her children the pride, the guts, and the devotion to God and man that would keep them out of harm's way. In fact, though, the two Bobbies, Kennedy and Shriver, had been smoking pot on and off for at least the better part of the last year. How could I have misjudged things so badly? Eunice now wondered. That night, there were a lot of hysterics at the compound as Eunice and Ethel, mostly Ethel, lit into their sons. About 2 days later, Sergeant Shriver, who had been in California, flew in to deal with this matter and get more information as to exactly what had transpired. "It's a setup," Ethel exclaimed when she finally heard the details about how the arrest happened. Eunice agreed. Apparently, a policeman from Boston had gone undercover as a hippie taxi driver named Andy Mose, and over the course of a couple weeks gave the two cousins and some of their friends free rides around Hyannisport in order to earn their trust. He even drove them to parties and observed their behavior, drinking beer and scotch. Then, during the course of one evening, he asked if they had any pot that they might sell him. He offered them $10 a joint. Not bad, the boys decided. They each had a little stash and gave Andy Mose a couple of joints. Eunice felt that the operation was illegal and constituted entrapment. Ethel agreed, saying that their boys had been targeted because they're Kennedys and that the family should not stand for it. Though Sargent did his best to reason with them, it was pretty useless. According to a family member in the home at the time, Sargent maintained that the police were simply doing their job and that the Kennedy youths shouldn't be let off the hook, even if they had been tricked. Sarge also wasn't convinced that they had been targeted, since 27 other youths had also been caught by the same dragnet operation involving Andy Mose. They shouldn't be buying it, smoking it, or selling it, no matter what, Sarge maintained. These kids are smoking pot. That's the issue here. Ethel became quiet, but not Eunice. "Well, I think we should sue," Eunice angrily told her husband, standing toe-to-toe with him. "For what?" Sargent wanted to know. "My God, I can see that you're going to be totally useless in this thing, aren't you?" A flabbergasted Eunice shot back at her husband. "This is not the time to be a nice guy, Sarge," she said, obviously alluding to his reputation as a bit of a softy. "This is the time to get mad. This is the time to fight back." Maybe that was the Kennedy way, but it wasn't always the Shriver way. Sargent was determined to keep his head, saying he felt it would set a bad example for the boys if the adults went up against law enforcement on this matter. Perhaps it was true that the boys' names shouldn't have been revealed, he conceded, since that seemed a violation of Massachusetts law. However, he saw no recourse other than for the family to just get tougher on the boys and deal with the real issue at hand, their recreational use of marijuana. The family managed to keep the embarrassing story under wraps until early August, when a hearing into the matter was scheduled. On August 5th, Ethel, Eunice, and Sarge, as well as Ted, accompanied their sons to Barnstable for private juvenile proceedings. Of course, the scene was pure pandemonium during the dreaded walk from the family's car to the Barnstable District Courthouse, with television cameras grinding, reporters calling out questions, strangers staring, and everyone shoving. For much of the time, Ethel seemed close to tears, while Eunice looked incredibly annoyed. Sarge and Ted seemed resigned to the moment. Both boys looked sheepish. "My Uncle Teddy gets away with stuff. How come we can't?" Bobby Kennedy Jr. had asked his mother earlier in the day. He was obviously referring to Chappaquiddick. "Don't you dare bring your Uncle Teddy into this," she told him angrily. "This has nothing to do with him." Indeed, there was a consequence of Chappaquiddick that was very personal to the third generation of Kennedys. There was a pervasive feeling among many of that generation, especially some of the sons of John, Bobby, and Ted, that their Uncle Teddy had gotten away with a crime. Accidents do happen, of course. However, there are usually consequences, especially if a death occurs. Yet, in the case of the senator and Mary Jo Kopechne, it seemed to some of the younger generation that there hadn't been much of a penalty. In their minds, the way Ted had ducked justice after the accident at Chappaquiddick only served to reinforce the notion that Kennedys were born with a sense of entitlement and were not always to be held responsible for their actions. Indeed, in years to come, this kind of warped thinking would wreak havoc in the lives of some of that next generation. In the end, the judge gave the boys a year of probation, standard treatment for first-time offenders, and sent them on their way. After the hearing, both Bobbies were quite embarrassed and feeling very guilty and sorry about the whole thing. Unfortunately, Bobby Kennedy Jr. didn't have a father who might try to help him make sense of what had occurred. He just had Ethel, who was clearly already pushed behind her limits as a mother, and she wasn't able to be much help to him. If Bobby thought he was going to have a meaningful dialogue with her about the temptations and perils of drug use, he was wrong. Instead, Ethel just ripped into him that night, chasing him all over the compound until finally catching up to him and pushing him headfirst into shrubbery. "Give me strength, Lord," she screamed up at the sky as she headed back to her home. After that, Ethel didn't want to talk about the matter at all. In fact, the subject never came up again, except for Ethel's tearful declaration that all these kids are bad kids, and I don't think there's anything we can do about it. Of course, Eunice Shriver was also very upset with her son, Bobby. "I am quite cross with you right now," is how she put it. However, Bobby Shriver had something that Bobby Kennedy Jr. didn't have, and it made all the difference in the world. He had Sergeant Shriver as a father. Sarge took his son into his study, sat down with him, and told him that while this had certainly been a bad situation, it most definitely wasn't the end of the world. "You are not a bad kid, and I don't care what anyone says," he told him. "In fact, you're a great kid. I know you learned your lesson, and I'm not worried about it at all," he told him, according to Bobby Shriver's later recollection. "And I don't want you to listen to a thing anyone else has to say around here, because you and your brothers and sister are not bad kids," he added, maybe referring to Ethel's comments. "We're going to get through this thing, son, and I know it won't happen again. I want you to know that I trust you," Sergeant said. And for Bobby Shriver, it never did happen again. In fact, he considers this troubling episode a defining moment in his life. He realized how lucky he was to have a father like Sarge, and how truly sad it was that his cousin Bobby Jr. didn't have someone to guide him through this difficult time in his life. True, Bobby had his Uncle Ted, but apparently Ted wasn't able to make much of an impression on him or manage his own life. Bobby Shriver vowed to never again let his father down. Sergeant and Eunice Shriver also made a decision to try and keep their children away from Ethel's three eldest, Joe, Bobby, and David, and that wasn't going to be easy. They were all great friends, but whenever possible, the Shrivers did what they could to separate, even if gently, the Kennedy boys from the Shrivers. And I'm just going to leave it there for this chapter. If you want to learn more about those very turbulent years of Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s life, his siblings, his mom, and what he went through after the assassination of his father, definitely check out my other book club series, The Dark Side of RFK Jr., which really puts those years in much clearer focus. And I also recommend, if you're interested in the assassination of Senator Kennedy, I actually produced a 14-part series, investigative true crime series called Who Killed Bobby Kennedy? And I think you'd find that interesting. I'm going to go ahead and put a link to that one down in the comments for you. So that'll keep you occupied until next time when we come back with another chapter of After Camelot by J. Randy Taraborelli. In the next chapter, in part 6, we're going to get into a lot of stuff. We're going to talk about the troubled at times, but I don't know. It's an interesting marriage. I don't know how to describe it. The marriage between Jackie Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis, such a story. And we're also going to talk about the Lawfords, Patricia Kennedy and Peter Lawford and the Rat Pack. And wow, this book gets really, really interesting. So be sure and join us for the next episode of After Camelot. Till then, be well. I'm your friend Laurie Spencer. Thanks for listening.